ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about Jane Eyre. Slightly less likely than Jane Austen to bore straight white male students to death. Slightly less likely than Jane Austen to bore every other student to death also. I had to read this when I was 12. 12! This is 500 pages of Victorian London. 12-year-old wants to read that. I mean, I like it now. I'm not 12 anymore. I like it now. I didn't then. Anyway, at its core, Jane Eyre is a story about a poor girl who gets an education and becomes independent. You can kind of see why we still read this nowadays. See, this has a big contrast with all of Jane Austen's works because if you've ever read a Jane Austen book, you've kind of read all of them. The stories are very different and I love them all, but the crux of it is basically every single time the girl, the main character is always a girl in Jane Austen novels, she'll have a love interest and she'll be safely at home with her family, somebody taking care of her, until she eventually and inevitably gets married to her love interest. Every time. Every time. I mean, I really do like Jane Austen novels, don't get me wrong, but Jane Eyre has a totally different feeling to it because it is a gothic Victorian novel. And let me be more specific about that. Not that kind of gothic. No. Gothic as a style in writing refers to an eerie or suspenseful feeling. And Jane Eyre has got quite a bit of that. Part of it, it's almost sinister in some parts, really. Like, our main character, Jane Eyre, she's an orphan. She's raised in a house of assholes, basically. Like, her aunt is an asshole, her cousins are assholes. It's a mess. It's all a mess. Anyway, she's nice though. She likes books. She likes books and she likes to be left alone, so they don't really like her because she doesn't fit in. Reading through Jane Eyre, there are some members of the reading audience who will be a little bit bummed out because Jane is such an introvert and she is such an outsider, and she embraces it. Her attitude is, this is who I am. I've gotten really good at being who I am, so I'm just gonna roll with it. You know, normally I suggest people go to my Tumblr blog to read more detail about books that I'm reviewing. I don't know if you want to do that for this one. It's like, Jane Eyre was the point where I decided to take a different tack in my book reviews and minimize. Like, not in the videos, but in the written reviews. This is the point where I decided it's time to narrow it down a little bit. Anyway, this is the point where I decided to narrow it down a bit, because up until Jane Eyre, I had been going chapter by chapter through all the classic lit books, but there are 37 chapters in Jane Eyre, and that's a lot of chapters. So, yeah. Revamping my writing style for the reviews after this, but there's plenty of information on my Tumblr if you want to go check it out. So, usually Jane Eyre is agreed upon to be divided into like 5 major parts of the story, like 5 major phases. Jane's childhood with the Reed family, her asshole family. Her childhood at school, and her school is a miserable place. I tell you that, like, Lowood, just the name, it's terrible. Everybody dies of typhus. Half the students literally die of typhus. Anyway, and then the third phase is when she embarks out on her own to become a governess at Thornfield, which is Mr. Rochester's house. The fourth is where she strikes out on her own again and ends up staying with a nice family who she discovers is actually her family. Spoiler alert! And the fifth is where she goes back to seek out Mr. Rochester again, and happy ending, everything's great. The end. Okay, some spoilers here. When I say everything's great, I actually mean that Mr. Rochester's house is burned down, he's disabled now, and blind. But the point is, they can be together now, which is what's important. Because before, when she was a governess in Mr. Rochester's house and they were kind of falling in love, it turns out that Mr. Rochester had his violently psychotic wife locked in the attic. All that comes out at the worst possible time. I tell you what, like, it's bad. The big takeaways from Jane Eyre is that you can be in love and still be yourself and still be fiercely independent. Also, life is better and easier if you have friends. Life is also better and easier if you have friends who have a lot of money, which Jane observes secondhand frequently throughout the book. It's kind of sad because, you know, the majority of Jane's life, she herself has next to no money, and she doesn't have any friends who have a lot of money. And in Victorian England, money is everything. You're gonna be working yourself to death unless you have some kind of an inheritance. So, yeah, it's like America nowadays. Anyway, if you did happen to go through my review on Tumblr, and you were reading through my writing, you may have possibly noticed that I have a little bit of a crush on Mr. Rochester. You know, it's not a big deal. It's not like it's in every post. Not like it colors my opinions. No. But, in my defense, as much as I love Jane, she's a great character, Mr. Rochester is possibly the most interesting thing about this book. First, let's talk about the fact that he has his psychotic, violent wife locked up in the attic. Like, let's talk. She was perfectly socially integrated when they got married. Like, his brother and his dad made him marry her because she was pretty and eligible and rich. But, a little bit after their wedding, she started showing some signs that she needed help. And in Victorian London, the alternative to locking her in the attic would be sending her to an institution. So, really, it's kinder this way. But besides that, Mr. Rochester is an interesting character because he's part of what makes this book a little bit eerie. Like, Jane Austen... I almost said Jane Austen. Anyway, like, Jane Eyre, like the character Jane, she's working as a governess in Mr. Rochester's house for his ward, this girl that he adopted, this little, like, 8-9-year-old. Anyway, Jane is working as her governess, and there's a secret, like, she doesn't know that there's a woman locked in the attic, but she knows something's going on, because the servants kind of talk, and people kind of talk, and stuff happens. You know, Mr. Rochester's bed gets lit on fire one night. So, you know, he keeps his household in this kind of state of secrecy that Jane is having to muddle through. Also, Mr. Rochester has this odd habit of going on rants, like pages of rants. And they're entertaining, like, don't get me wrong, they're entertaining. He's a very energetic, excitable kind of guy. But and then Jane is so patient about it, she'll just sit there and listen and be like, that's nice. But, it's like Mr. Rochester not only has this, but in addition to these highs, he'll go on these rants. He'll have lows of depressive behavior. So this is like one of the earliest examples of manic depressive disorder in classic literature. I like that. Seriously, love this guy. He makes the book. As a supporting character, he makes the book. Tell ya. As always, I offer up more information on my Tumblr blog. Feel free to visit me. And this has been E.K. Rochford with reviews you want for the books you don't. Let me just paraphrase this one conversation. It's, well, how have you been? I'm doing good. I'm fine. Why didn't you come talk to me in the party? You looked busy. And then he's all like, oh, don't try to tell me that you're not sad. I know you're sad. Your face looks sad. God, I love this book. But in addition to these manic highs where he'll be on these rants and rambles and excitable, like, everything's going like, we'll also have these times when he's like depressed and moody and he takes off at the drop of a hat, and you know, he has some pretty clear symptoms of bipolar disorder. God, he's such a great